So I asked this question earlier on. How do we make difficult Bible verses and difficult scriptures accessible to children? We want to encourage children to read the Bible, don't we? We want to encourage them to know the things that it says. We want them to develop their lives based on it. But sometimes we are tempted to, fall into the same old patterns and the same old stories. But don't they also need to address perhaps some of the difficult, more challenging, or more, sometimes off-putting scriptures as well? How do we make that work? And how do we communicate effectively? Well, someone who has more than a few ideas on this is Zoe Carter, who is a children's worker in Edinburgh. She's also a sculptor, and she has, committed herself to writing books and developing techniques to work with children through, they call it kinesthetic learning, don't they? Through doing stuff. She's on the line with me this morning. Zoe, welcome to UCB.
Thank you.
It is important, this, isn't it? Because we do tend to fall into the same few Bible stories when talking to children, and actually difficult passages of Scripture and difficult concepts in Scripture, children need to be given the chance to grapple with them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. You find that with such a vast amount of information within the Bible and such a vast amount of life-giving information, and children are often given just the surface, which is just such a shame.
So as you sat down to look at this from your own point of view and from your own work and writing your books and so on, what was it that drew you to addressing this specifically?
I think it was in my own personal journey, growing up in a Christian home and being absolutely blessed by the education that I had when I was a child, within church and within a Christian family and within a Christian community. But then I think as I was engaging with some of the bigger issues of growing up, and as I started to enter into adolescence and then into adulthood, and realizing that sort of my whole faith kind of needed a sort of a rejig in order to accommodate, the realities of life. And that was what specifically started me on writing about Ecclesiastes for kids, because I just found that that's a book that barely gets touched by adults, but actually it talks about disappointment, which is such a big aspect of all of our lives, and kids are not immune from that at all either. Kids in some ways feel disappointment more acutely than adults do. And actually, the Bible has a lot to say about it. The Bible addresses it, and the Bible gives us hope through it.
And your book on the subject of Ecclesiastes is Sir Lived-a-Lot. Tell us a little about him.
Well, what I found was that when I was trying to talk to children about more abstract ideas, they it sort of felt a bit like reading an IKEA textbook where, I got a bit lost, they got a bit lost, and then afterwards, if I asked them if they understood the lesson, they said, not really. I found that through writing stories, it kind of created a vehicle to be able to carry abstract ideas. I took the idea of searching for happiness, which is something familiar to the author of Ecclesiastes and familiar to all of us, really. And I sort of translated this into a story about a knight on a quest searching for the golden happy face. And where he could, the types of places he looked for it, and the kind of results he experienced, and then finally what the golden happy face looked like. And I specifically wanted to kind of address the topic of looking for happiness in the world. I wrote a sequel to Sir Lived-a-Lot called Time, which was about experiencing sadness as a Christian, and actually how in that passage in Ecclesiastes about there being a time for weeping as well as a time for laughter, and this being no less spiritual or and the idea of rather than sort of trying to stay in one period all the time, actually more sort of accepting the ups and downs and inviting God to sort of ride the roller coaster of life with us and to share our sadness with us as well as our happiness,
And then as you say, you take these abstract elements of scripture and these things that perhaps are difficult to get your head around as an adult, and then by giving it a personality. I'm thinking of Daisy Dirt, for example.
Yes.
There's she, a worthless piece of dirt. Everyone wants to wipe her away, as the blurb for the book says. But actually, transformation is, well, it's going to happen, but it needs to be given a little bit of time for it to develop. Now, the moment you give a personality to that, a child can grasp the concept. Let's be honest, it makes it easier for us as adults to grasp the concept as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when you Daisy Dirt was specifically a book about a book about the natural process of a oyster shell turning a piece of dirt into a pearl. And I think that when we see these natural transformations in nature, it kind of it really echoes the glory of God, and it also can kind of bring these lessons home, because, talking about things like transforming our soul and transforming our heart, for a child who's very literal, that can be, that can sound rather odd, and it can sort of sound rather difficult to grasp. Whereas when you give something more physical, even scary, because, transform me into what exactly? Whereas if you, if you kind of look at ways of kind of personifying things, what I kind of find is that kind of gives it, sometimes that kind of gives it the relatability, but also sometimes the distance to be able to engage it better. This is why, for my series on Proverbs, I specifically decided to write about animals rather than children, because some of the bit in Proverbs can be quite graphic. And what I found was that, and indeed, not even talking about explicit subjects, which obviously I completely skip over, but even just talking about the consequences of bad choices, those can be very upsetting. So when I was writing a story about telling lies and being caught in a web, I felt that if that pictured a child being caught in a gigantic web, that might be quite upsetting. Whereas if I do a picture of an elephant being caught in a spider's web, that can be sort of more humorous, and it kind of takes the edge off, and it makes it easier to relate to. And
looking at your website, zoecraftbook.com, just for those that want to find out more about you, there seems to be, as I mentioned at the beginning, an emphasis from you about the importance of action. And even with the books, not just reading with or reading to, but discussing around the themes and working those through. That sort of activity with the child, whether it be around craft or whether it be around conversation, also very, very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I just find it... in terms of learning, learning, in order to it to last, it has to have lots of layers. Children's ability to retain stuff can be remarkable. I've heard a child recite the entire soundtrack to Frozen without really understanding the words at all. Yes. So I kind of find that in terms of, now, I think that scripture memory is a wonderful thing. I still remember some of the Bible verses I learned from as young as 3 or 4. It's just that in terms of comprehension, that's not really enough. And I kind of find that by introducing art activities, by introducing discussion, by introducing different ways to really engage a child, the idea isn't necessarily that a child will do an activity or have a discussion and instantly become an expert and learn everything off by heart. It's more about, sort of trying to get the child on the process of thinking and get the child to really begin to engage with these ideas, and then let them develop as they grow up, so that they have these ideas with them, and they can take them into their everyday life, and they can have a have some ideas about life that are different to the kind of rhetoric of society, which just tells us things like follow your heart or reach for the stars or whatever, and actually there's nothing at the stars really, and following our heart often gets us into trouble and this kind of thing. So it kind of gives them an alternative.
Brilliant thought. And a tremendous website and tremendous load of resources that are there as well. ZoeCraftBook.com and Zoe's books, where you can find out about them on her website, or just do an online search for the whole range of books. And there are a multitudinous amount of books that are in the range by Zoe Carter. Have a look at them for yourself. And Zoe, lovely to speak to you today. Some challenging thoughts there. Thank you for joining us.
That's okay. Thank you very much.